In part 1, we exposed the biggest myth about money. In this final part of the money myth, we pull back the curtain on the financial system's greatest deception and reveal what must be done before it's too late. Stay with me, this is knowledge they don't want you to have. Now, the obvious question is, if it is so easy to create money and credit almost costlessly, and we produce or are capable of producing far more real wealth in goods than we can use, why is it that there is never enough money available to purchase all we want, and in many cases what we need, without going into debt? This is true at every level of our society, from government, public bodies such as the Water Board, Electricity Authority, public transport, local councils, private business, right down to families and individuals, many of whom never really own anything, as everything from their home, their car, and even clothing is bought on time payment, and, with carefully calculated obsolescence by the time they are paid for, they are often worn out. Now, if you ask any 6 orthodox economists to answer the above question, it's a pretty safe bet that you will get 6 different answers. For the fact is that although economics is called a science, it is about as scientific as a voodoo cult, and orthodox economists about as scientific as a New Guinea headhunter. In fact, my opinion of economists is perfectly expressed by Sir Randall Home, past president of the British Law Society, who says, "In the days of the Roman Empire, when the state was in danger and the Senate did not know what to do, it was the custom to consult the augurers, and they in turn examined the entrails of a new killed fowl. We have abandoned these barbarous practices, and nowadays, instead of examining the entrails of a fowl, we consult economic experts. But alas, all history and experience go to prove that after all, the Roman system was the better. For if at any time during the past 20 years, instead of consulting the economic experts, our politicians had examined the entrails of a fowl, there would have been at least a 50-50 chance that common sense would have prevailed. Economics and finance should be as practical and scientific and as easily controlled as our system of weights and measures. But it is obvious that while we, the ordinary people, have the initiative, the courage and the practical know-how to produce real wealth in abundance, because our economists and politicians have not got enough wit to evolve a practical, just and scientific system to distribute it. Why? Because orthodox economists are carefully trained to be the obedient servants of the owners of debt and to perpetuate the creation of debt. That is why you will find that all the people that have seen through the rotten sham of our present monetary system and provided viable solutions to the problem have all been people trained to think in terms of physical realities. People concerned with unquestionable principles. People who analyze the evidence sensibly and logically and then evolve practical solutions. They are usually found among such people as physical scientists or engineers. Never are they, or will they, be found among orthodox economists. For example, Professor Frederick Soddy of Oxford University, who in addition to writing many scientific books and lecturing on scientific subjects, also made a very shrewd and analytical study of the monetary system, saw it for the shoddy fraud that it is, and gave us the remedy in books such as The Role of Money and Money versus Man. Then there is that great Australian H.W. Monaghan, who has been writing and lecturing for most of his adult life, revealing the utter inadequacy of economists to produce a sane and just solution to our social and monetary problems. Last, but no means least, is that great engineer, Major C.H. Douglas, whose logical mind proved that social debt could be and should be replaced by social credit. And there are many more. It was Douglas who produced the well-known A+B theorem. And please don't let us confuse a theorem with a mere theory. A theory is little more than a supposition or a speculation, while a theorem is a proposition proved by a chain or reasoning, a truth established by means of accepted truths. It proves mathematically why it will always be necessary to inject sufficient money or credit into our economy to ensure the complete distribution of all the goods and services that science and industry can produce. Furthermore, his system of social credit could free the nations of the world from the evils of the present overwhelming social debt. The sheer logic and truth of the A plus B theorem is so clear that it is hard to understand how any sensible person could reject it. But of course, it was anathema to the economists or their masters, the bankers, so they used the very effective weapon of ridicule to suppress it, and by the use of their very powerful propaganda machine, they soon had the uninformed and unthinking among us ridiculing it too. For this crass stupidity we are now paying a heavy penalty. I think the diagram explains the A plus B theorem clearly. The figures are not meant to represent actual percentages of the various costs involved, but it must be obvious that no amount of juggling or economists' jargon can alter the simple fact that the combined A plus B costs have produced goods to the value of $100. But only $48 has been made available to purchase these goods. And another factor that has to be considered is that in most instances, the goods do not come onto the market for weeks and often months after the wages, salaries and dividends that entered into the cost of their production have already been spent. Now, while the economists ridiculed this obvious fact, they insisted that additional purchasing power was required to give the economy some semblance of stability. But they also insisted that this must become available as a debt to the bankers. Otherwise, we should have inflation. Well, we have been doing it their way for many years, and what have we got? So, what they would not admit openly, they admitted by stealth and deception. Unfortunately for us, most people, including our leaders, accept this deception without question. As a result, the disclosed assets of the banks in Australia in the early 1980s was $152,000 million. What their undisclosed assets were, or for that matter are now, we shall never know. But one thing is sure, they are considerably greater than the above figure, and on top of this, the entire nation is staggering under a massive load of debt, not only to the local money manipulators, but to the international bankers who make our local banks look like pikers. As one exasperated poet has put it, the bigger the debt and the higher the tax, the fatter the maker of money doth wax, while the borrower, caught like a fly in a mesh, must finally pay with a pound of his flesh. So what it amounts to is this. Due to our ignorance and apathy, we have allowed our economic system to become subordinated to a financial hierarchy based on the will to power the few over the many. We have allowed deficit financing, created almost costlessly by the private banking system, to provide a license for elected governments of whatever party to remain in office. And this is in spite of the fact that the Royal Commission, set up to examine our financial system after the Great Depression of 1929-33 to find the cause of it, and hopefully to prevent a repetition of it, stated in Section 504 of its report that the Commonwealth Bank had the power given to it by the Australian Constitution to issue all the money required to finance all this nation's requirements, free of debt and interest. This same power is also available to the Reserve Bank, which actually uses it, but only to a very limited extent. This was revealed in March 1982 by Mr. F.C.H. Pooley, who has the impressive title of Acting First Assistant, Secretary of Revenue, Loans and Investment Division of the Reserve Bank. Even under the weight of a title like that, he was able to say, "External bills are issued to the Reserve Bank as security for funds advanced to the Commonwealth at an interest rate of 1% per annum to supplement the funds in the public accounts. Other similar bills are issued in respect of state government borrowing, also at a maximum yield of 1% per annum, but they have to be redeemed within 90 days. And this proves that the Reserve Bank can issue money to our governments at a cost of no more than 1% per annum. Now, don't you think there is cause for suspicion when this money is only made available in small quantities and only for 90-day periods? This money is made available to finance temporary state deficits. It could just as easily be made available to finance all the nation's needs, as our Constitution tells us specifically in Section 51. But no matter whether we have a Liberal or Labour government in power, this wonderful facility is never used. In other words, our Reserve Bank has become the servant of our money masters. If we ever insist upon it performing its proper function of supplying all this nation's monetary needs at a cost of 1% per annum, the monopoly of the money masters would be broken and this nation would be truly free. But let us not delude ourselves. To prevent this happening, the money masters will let loose upon us the massive power of their propaganda machine, which is kept well oiled with our money, for the funding of governments is gilt-edged security, backed by the real wealth of the entire nation. Our Reserve Bank is playing its part along with its counterparts in other countries to ensure that the world's money masters realize their long-cherished ambition, which is a world socialist state with the bankers as its unassailable rulers, and it will be foisted upon us under the guise of the New World Economic Order. This is a good place to say something about the fallacious theory that it is essential for us to maintain what is euphoniously called a favorable trade balance for the nation to be prosperous, or, as it is sometimes called, an export surplus. In the first place, it is obviously impossible for every nation to have and maintain an export surplus. Economists would have us believe that in order to maintain prosperity, England must export, say, 1,000 cars to Germany, which must in turn export 1,000 cars to America, which must export 1,000 cars to Japan, and Japan must export 1,000 back to England. If these cars had been left in the country of their origin, the additional costs of packing, handling, freighting and insurance would have been saved. And quite often, in order to maintain an export surplus, goods have to receive a subsidy from the government, which of course means the taxpayer. Recently, I read that Japan, for the first time, had imported more silk than it had exported. So why did they export any silk at all if they needed it themselves? Australia has a first-class textile industry which is under threat unless we can find more export outlets, we are told, and yet Australia is importing more textiles than she exports. The whole thing is full of similar anomalies. The fact is that any country having a continuous export surplus is actually undergoing an actual physical loss. Its real wealth in goods is mostly being replaced by fictitious wealth. To carry this to the extreme, a country which exported the whole of its production of goods for which it received only money could not continue to exist. When a country exports too much of its production of goods, the real standard of living of its people is lowered. This is demonstrated during a war when huge quantities of armaments are exported while it becomes necessary to ration consumer goods, although personal incomes are in excess of peacetime levels. To put it briefly, why import money which has to be converted into our own currency so that we can buy our own commodities, while we export our real wealth in minerals, metals and food? Foreign aid and military expenditure abroad plays a major role in producing unfavorable trade balances. Once it is realized that today's money has no intrinsic value, but is merely a convenient exchange mechanism, that a continuous export surplus is a dead loss, not a favorable balance of trade, then it may be seen that the existing financial system is the underlying mechanism of our headlong progress towards disaster, financially and morally. In the light of all this, it would appear that all our boasted scientific and technological accomplishments have merely made it possible for us to go backwards at an ever-increasing speed. The time is long overdue for us to have a good, honest look at what is needed to make our industrial, economic and financial systems reliable, stable and capable of not only producing adequate food, clothing, and shelter for everyone, but also complete and intelligent, controlled distribution of them, without destroying the right of every individual to freedom, self-expression, fulfillment, and a reasonable amount of happiness. First, we must realize that the main function of industry is no longer to provide full employment. This is impossible, while the most inventive brains in the world are hell-bent on putting everyone out of work by the means of automation. Therefore, the main function of industry must be to produce adequate amounts of goods and services for everyone. The main function of governments must be to ensure that they are not equally distributed, but fairly distributed. So, what we have to devise is an economic and monetary system that makes it possible to distribute to everyone in the nation the total products of goods and services without getting swamped in debt to the bankers. As this appears to be beyond the wit of economists and politicians, we shall have to do it ourselves, and then see that we elect the leaders of the right caliber and with sufficient courage to defy the bankers. Obviously, in a talk such as this, it is impossible to supply a detailed plan, but I will quote from Professor Soddy, who says, "All that is necessary is to have a system of creating new money if the price level tends to fall and unsaleable goods to stack up, and to destroy it if they get scarcer and prices tend to rise." This is quite impossible under the present banking system, but is quite possible under a rational, scientific and national system, designed in accordance with the physical realities to which the production and consumption of wealth must conform. To imagine otherwise is to attempt to preserve a system in which money is issued not to distribute wealth, but as a source of revenue. If there is one lesson that the history of money enforces, it is that when its issue is used as a means of enriching the issuer, whether the issuer be the state, the bank, or the counterfeiter, it is the most disintegrating and dangerous power ever invented by man. If there is any such thing as a corporate will or corporate sense of danger in a community, it is imperative that this lesson be learned before it is too late. V.C. Vickers puts it this way: any additional supply of money should be issued as a clear asset to the nation, so that money will be spent into existence, not lent into existence. To accomplish this, the control of money and credit must be placed on a logical, scientific basis. The Reserve, Commonwealth and State banks must be allowed to perform their full and proper function given to them by our Constitution of providing sufficient debt-free money to ensure the efficient functioning and growth of the Australian nation. If we fail to do this now, we are doomed to become a vassal state in a world dominated by a ruthless financial hierarchy, which cares no more for the immolation of a nation than for the death of a sparrow. We must study the books written by intelligent, informed, logical and courageous people in order to have the truth at our disposal, for only the truth can make us free. We must leave our leaders in no doubt about the reforms we demand and to our economic and financial systems, and we must make them realize that we will no longer accept this ineptitude of economists and political parties or the ruthless exploitation to which we have been subjected for so long by world bankers, right to state and federal treasurers, to state and federal members. Keep on writing and get your friends to do the same. Give them no rest. This is Australia's opportunity to achieve real greatness, not by conquering other nations, but by breaking free from the bondage of the hidden government of money masters and setting an example for the rest of the world to follow. The truth is out there, buried beneath decades of deception, but within our reach. We must demand change, challenge the system, and refuse to be ruled by financial overlords who see nations as nothing more than numbers on a ledger. So what can you do? Learn, question, speak out. Let your leaders know that Australians will no longer be economic pawns. And if you want to keep exposing the myths that shape our world, subscribe, stay informed, and share this message. Because only the truth can set us free.